Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Governor, for being here. Yesterday, I appreciate the opportunity of having some time to spend with you and ask you some specific questions. A lot of them are being asked again today about costs. And as I told you, I come from a very unique perspective because I've been involved with banks, I've been a retailer, and I've been a CPA that audited both. So when it comes to my CPA background, I always look at costs and what are the true costs of any transaction. And yesterday we had I asked you the same questions that many of my colleagues are asking you. Do we have all the costs? If we're going to impose, and as I called it yesterday, a price fix, and I know you corrected me by saying a standard, it doesn't matter what we call it. If we're going to impose a set fee, do we have all the costs to compare? And I think your answer yesterday, and I think your answer today has been the same thing. We do not have, under statute, the ability to look at all those costs. And that concerns me because if we're going to come up with a standard and you're being given this task to come up with a standard rate, you need to be able to look at all costs. Now, over the last couple of weeks, I've talked to retailers and I've talked to bankers, and I've had costs submitted to me, which I told you yesterday show that they're a lot more than 7 cents or 12 cents. But I really think the answer here is how do we get to the right standard, as you called it yesterday? And my concern is that you have been tasked with only coming up with a standard, and your hands are tied at looking at all these costs that are also available. And it's not just fraud. I mean, as a CPA, there's cost, there's overhead, there's the labor, the technology, all the things that are necessary to run a debit card. So my question for you is, in moving forward in establishing this final rule, would you be willing and able to willing to identify and consider those additional costs? And if you can't, because of statute, would you need a congressional fix so that you can look at these things? And my other question is, and I know a lot of people have talked about delay, it's not about getting it, it's not about how fast we get it done, it's about getting it done right. So I've asked you a couple questions there, but would you consider looking at those costs without a fix, a congressional fix?
Well, thank you for that, and I too benefited enormously from our conversation. The idea of costs is absolutely critical in terms of getting this right. We want to make sure, in fact, that we are looking at all the costs possible. And then I think it's fair to say we should sift those costs through the parameters of the statute to determine which would be permissible by law, assuming that this is, in fact, the law that we're dealing with. So the surveys that we did turn out to have been quite comprehensive in terms of gathering costs. So while in the proposal you're seeing a fairly narrow band of permissible costs, for purposes of our methodology, we in fact collected quite a breadth of costs. So we went beyond the authorization, clearing, and settlement costs. We looked at fixed costs. We looked at all variable costs. We essentially tried to get a broad understanding. Now, whether it's broad enough for your CPA mind, I'm not sure, but my understanding is that it was a fairly broad-based set of costs. And what I am more than happy to do is make sure that we provide that aggregate data to you and your colleagues so that you could actually provide some kind of feedback regarding how essentially that looks.
But are you agreeing that all costs are not being evaluated because the statute does not allow you to evaluate all costs?
No, we should evaluate. We need to look at costs, okay? And we have to. We were trying to pull them out through the survey and through this comment period. We're going to continue.
I guess I'm going to ask yes or no. Do you agree that yes, there are costs that were not able to be evaluated because the statute limited your ability to look at all costs?
I don't know if I can answer it with like a simple yes or no, because I think there are a lot of we need to look at a lot of costs and move them through the parameters of the statute and see whether they would be permissible.
Well, yeah, again, it's interpretation, I understand, but I think there are a lot of costs that were talked about that really are not being evaluated, and we need to get them all. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. And I appreciate my comments, or the comments from my colleague on the other side that said, we need to delay this to the point to get it right. A delay for just having a delay is not a good delay, but a delay for doing it right is important.
And again, you know, a delay is fully within the prerogative of the Congress.
Mr. Lynch.